this. I want to reflect on the national dialogue that's begun and the ways in which you talk about tough topics, in particular in the wake of those two grand jury results that came out both in Ferguson and New York. And I'll give a little bit of context, and then I want to suggest ways in which I think we as a school, all of us, can have difficult conversations. Now, last week, when the Staten Island ruling came out, I was in New York, and it was a busy, disrupted week for me. I had a couple of days of meetings with alumni and events in New York, and then I had to get on a plane to Atlanta. And those trips are important. I genuinely love talking to parents and alumni, but there's a lot of alone time as well. You're sitting in airports, you're in cabs, driving unfamiliar streets. You find yourself in a hotel, waking up with the TV still on, not quite sure where you are. So there's two kinds of energy, if you will. On one hand, you're excited, you're having intense social interactions, but then there are times of solitude and reflection. And it was in that latter mood when I was sitting in a hotel room in Midtown Manhattan that I turned on the news and I heard the New York grand jury that it had decided not to indict a white police officer in the death of Eric Garner, who, as you all know, no doubt from watching the news or seeing the video, was an unarmed black man who was accused of selling cigarettes illegally. And I remember sitting in that hotel room in Midtown, the TV glowing, and I felt immediately profoundly saddened and dispirited even. I felt the kind of fatigue because I knew, and I think most of us knew, what our nation was soon going to experience. I could predict the battle lines, I could anticipate the voices, and I was fearful that we were going to repeat the cycle where the only thing that people had in common was a conviction that they had to shout louder than the other guy in order to be heard. And there's a kind of insanity to that, and I thought we have to be better. So that's what I want to address. How can we be better, both as a nation? How can we be better as a school? Now, I cannot pretend to tell you what to think about those verdicts, about the protests, about the justice system. You are smart. You're old enough to have your own opinions. You should be informed. I certainly am still forming my own opinions. But I do have, so I won't tell you how you should read them. And I assume that there's going to be enormous diversity of perspectives in those rulings. But I do have a very strong belief, and a pretty optimistic belief as well, that if we need to do three things as a school, any community really has to do three things if you're going to take on culturally complicated topics with diverse viewpoints. And I think that as a nation which seems bent on outshouting itself, it is struggling to accomplish what I like to believe we can do in a school that's committed to a liberal education and to the respectful exchange of differing ideas. So I'm going to suggest three things that I hope you can do and that are part of our educational process all the time and in taking on tough topics. Here's the first. I think it's vital when you want to engage in a conversation about a complicated issue that you become informed. I love debate. I love disagreement. I love the intellectual exercise of people, of the clash of ideas and intellects. I think that's how we become sharper. It's part of a good liberal education. I hope over your years here you get practice in that. I hope you develop the skills in defending an argument, in whether it's defending lab results or talking about current events, perhaps a debate in an English class about a poem or a novel, perhaps a moment in history you're looking at in a history class. But there is nothing as maddening as the uninformed zealot, the person who's got lots of opinions but has no information. So you should do all you can to be informed. And if you're going to engage in the dialogue, and I truly hope you are, about events like Ferguson and Staten Island, you need to form an opinion that's based on accurate information and, by the way, an understanding of the different views. It takes a little work, but it's not that hard. You should watch the news on TV or online. You should read major newspapers and editorials. You should observe debates. You should follow blogs. I certainly have been doing that a lot in the last 2 weeks. And I also think you should work hard to listen to voices that discomfort you, right? Don't only listen to the affirming voices. That's the easy thing to do. Wherever your political spectrum, where you may fall in that spectrum, don't simply listen to the voices that simply tell you you're right. Actually, seek those who would challenge you. And if there's something you don't understand, ask it. Take the time to recognize, I need to be informed, so I will ask questions. So you have to be informed. Second, I think it's important you do this. I think you want to be very willing, and this, by the way, again, has to do with current events. It can take place in a class or wherever. It can take place in a conversation with a roommate, a friend. You want to be clear that you recognize your own bias, that you recognize whatever baggage you bring from your own upbringing, your environment, that will factor into that conversation. We are, of course, to varying degrees, products of our environment. And we're shaped by geography, by class, by race, ethnicity, religion, and so on. We all are shaped by those things. And that's a fact. It's neither good nor bad. It's simply a fact. Sometimes our perspective seems inseparably linked to that environment. Sometimes we are rejecting it, and sometimes we're actually trying to figure out, and our opinions are changing. Whatever the case, you need to recognize your bias. I think you need to have the courage to look inside and say, what bias do I bring to this conversation based on my own experience? Let me give you an example. There is considerable discussion right now in the nation, on the street, in churches, even in the White House, about the distrust of law enforcement in communities of color. And I followed that conversation, and what it's made me say is, I need to ask myself, in what way does my own experience, growing up in a little town in Connecticut in the late 1960s and 70s, in what way does that shape my own view of law enforcement? Surely I must bring some perspective into that, and surely my perspective will be different than others. I hadn't thought a lot about that question until recently. Let me tell you the bias I bring, and I hope I always am aware of this in the conversation. When I was a boy in this little town, you knew policemen pretty well. A bike ride up the street, literally a half mile up the street, lived 2 cops. When you pedaled by, you saw the police car in their driveway. On a sunny, hot day, they might be washing the car. There might be a couple of neighborhood kids helping hose down. If you crossed Main Street, maybe after church or after a high school basketball game, there was probably a cop waving you in, telling the cars to come in. There was a good chance that he knew who you were. He probably knew the names of your parents. And his son or daughter might have been in class with you. I played football in the police athletic league, and yes, as the name suggests, a lot of the coaches were cops. And so the policemen were around. They were part of the community. They were literally neighbors. I don't recall getting into trouble with a policeman. I was, I think, a pretty good kid. The closest I came was on a Halloween one night when a bunch of buddies and I egged a guy's house. We had to. He had threatened to shoot my buddy Bruce's dog. So we took some eggs and, put them in our shirts like this, and we ran up, knocked on the door, and when he opened the door, we egged the house. Such is the maturity of a 12-year-old. The police were waiting for us up the block. It's a small town. The guy had probably already told them that we were going to be doing it. We all ran away. They grabbed us. I managed to hide underneath a car. And there are advantages to being small. I wasn't caught, but Bruce and Kurt were caught. And what happened? The cop put them in the car, drove up the road to their house, knocked on the door, had both their parents came out and turned it over to the parents, and the parents scolded them pretty badly. That was my understanding of what police did when you broke a rule. Now, I don't tell it to be funny. This is not, there's a truth to this. I tell it because it reveals the bias that I have to bring. That's my brush with the law, if you will. And so the question, how do we view law enforcement, and certainly for me, is shaped by that upbringing. It doesn't matter whether I'm proud or not of the environment I was raised in. I happen to be. That's not the point. What matters is that I bring a bias that's rooted into that experience and where the police were neighbors, and I must have no illusion that my perspective is one shared by anyone else. Certainly, an African-American boy my age living in an urban area would have had a very different experience. And so I have to recognize that bias. I have to present it openly. I hope that I ask for recognition. And if I do, then I'll be better at understanding and empathizing with someone else's perspective. So that's the second thing, to recognize the bias. Here's the third, and I think the most important, as a school that takes on complicated issues, as I say everywhere. It has to do with asking a single compelling question, and I hope you use this often, whether it's a debate in a conversation in class, whether it's a conversation more informally at the lunchroom or with a roommate. I think there are times in history when a nation needs more than anything of its citizens on the street corners, in the churches, in community gatherings, in legislative offices, where in good faith and in deep curiosity and with profound respect, this question is asked. Can you help me understand why you think what you do? Can you help me understand why you think what you do? If we are able to ask that, if you are able to ask that as a result of your experience here, you're going to have enormous advantages. I can't think of a question that is so powerful and liberating to both the questioner and the respondent as that question. And I hope that the question on the campus will become what they call a lingua franca, a kind of language that we are all fluent in. And if it does, we may be able to do something that our nation is struggling to do. And I think we will feel a kind of optimism that's hard to feel at the national level. Now, to be clear, you cannot simply ask the question, can you help me understand why you think what you do? I think there are ground rules. And there are three ground rules, and it's a very potent question. Here are the three ground rules. The person asking the question has to do three things. You can't interrupt, you can't judge, and you can't choose not to listen. And by the way, don't underestimate how hard that is. First, you're going to want to interrupt. You ask the question, and then you're going to want to interrupt. And you're going to want to disagree because, of course, you also want to be heard. So there's a temptation after asking that question to interrupt, but you can't. The deal is, if you ask, you're going to listen to the complete answer, and that means you won't interrupt. The second, judging, that's also hard. We all tend to judge. We know what that's like. Even though you ask the question, deep down inside, you think you're right. You think that you know what you're talking about. And then when you hear things that are unfamiliar or unsettling, it's easy to place value on what you hear. And if you can devalue it, if you can say it's lesser than, if you can attach a value judgment to it, then you don't have to listen to it as much. So again, that's not the deal. If you're going to ask that question respectfully, you're going to then have to say, I am going to withhold judgment. I'm not going to interrupt. I'm going to withhold judgment. And then the third thing you have to do, this is not easy as well, you've got to listen. You may want to say, I've heard enough. I don't want to hear anymore. But you don't get that right. You can't ask that question authentically and with curiosity and respect and then say, I don't want to hear it. You can't pull an Austin Powers, right? You can't zip it. Psst, can't do that. You have heard enough when he or she is done giving the answer. And I mean hear. I don't mean to simply hear. I mean really listen. And we all know the difference. You know the difference when you're being scolded and you pretend to be listening, but you're only hearing. So you have to do that. Now, don't think that because you were asked the question, you get off the hook. You don't get off easy. It's a two-way deal. You have to honor the ask by being honest, by being complete, and by being patient. Let me explain what I mean, because that's not easy either. Being honest isn't always easy, especially when you want to share things, or you may have to share things that are close, or that are personal, that are maybe even painful. So in that conversation I'm having perhaps with someone about how do I view the law enforcement, I give that story. I have to be honest. I have to share this is my perspective in hopes that someone else would be as well. You have to be complete if you're going to answer that question. If you're going to honor that ask, truly honor it, you have to share all that you can. You have to be complete. You can't simply tell half the story and then later say to the listener, you didn't get it. You have to be complete. And then you have to be patient. You have to be really patient. And that's especially hard if no one before has ever even asked you, can you help me understand why you think what you do? You may want to explode, don't you get it? And they may not. And you're going to have to be patient. It's going to be the last thing you have and the first thing you'll need. And then there's one last thing you do when that happens. After you've spoken, you have to look across the table and you have to then look at that other person and say, now help me understand why you think the way you do. You don't get off easy. You don't get to have all the fun of all the talking. When you get done, it's your turn to listen, and then the real fun starts. Then you can begin the kind of exchange and respectful listening and debate and dialogue that's so critical. There is something so powerful about that question, about the way it requires that we recognize each other, about the way it makes it very hard to judge, about how it forces us to empathize, about how it lets us disagree, and about how it requires that we listen. And I think that carrying on this conversation at the national level is extraordinarily hard. I'm not sure that a leader has emerged who can really conduct it. We've had leaders in the past, and some of our nation's brightest moments in history, I think, are when there's been an eloquence and strength in that leader, whether that's a Lincoln or a Kennedy or a King. I hope that we'll know those days again. But I will confess that when I sat in the hotel room, listened to the sirens out in the streets, I felt dispirited and I heard the volume of those voices increase, and I saw that no one was listening. So it was, for me, deeply restorative, and I mean that truly, to come back on campus, to speak to so many students and colleagues, to be part of fascinating conversations, to see acts of respect and true listening and debate and discussion. I was restored to a kind of optimism. And so I really believe that, I hope, and I believe that, and have a faith, I think, that maybe that leader of tomorrow, that person who is going to be able to help those conversations in the future, is sitting here. And perhaps if that's you, that one day you'll think to yourself, I had a kind of rehearsal in that at Taft. I was trained in that skill. And I was asked over and over again to ask that question and then follow those ground rules every time I did. And I'd like to think that you get that rehearsal here. So it's with that sense, first of all, of appreciation of a terrific fall, and with a sense that there's a really interesting conversation, and it will never end, and I hope this kind of conversation happens all the time on our campus. To the seniors especially, you've had an amazing fall. I know this is a tough week as you look into exams, and some of you here from colleges. The leadership has been terrific. For all of you, maintain your energy. The end is so closely in sight. Exams will be upon us soon. You're all going to do well. You're going to get through it. And I guess I close by saying that Ezra has told me that there will be some walkout music, and you will walk out to the song Tuesday. I cannot tell. I know I'm taking my chances, so good luck on exams.
Sunny Digital.
Got the club going up on a Tuesday. Got your girl in the cut and she Tuesday.